Good day and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. In this video we're going to talk about making gold and making gold with the War Within, but especially talking about how you can prepare yourself to make gold and also take advantage if you are one of those people of the early access for War Within. Now making gold in an expansion is relatively simple, I want to say, to the degree that you want to go to. For example, if you want to make millions and millions and millions of gold, you're going to have to start doing things like practicing auction house flipping, resource scarcity, farming old recipes, and basically looking at farming very, very peculiar items to procure yourself millions of gold. You're also going to do what they call auction post trading, which essentially is like balancing the stock market. But yeah, there's a lot of really, really interesting ways. But for casuals and most players, your main method of making gold at the beginning of every expansion is going to be through gathering and crafting. So before we talk specifically about what advantages you can make and the best choices to do, we need to talk a little bit about the changes that are coming to both. So the main changes that will be coming in terms of the gathering is the materials. So in Dragonflight, we have different tiers of materials. When you are crafting or you are essentially gathering, what tends to happen is you have a range of materials that you can pick up. Every single piece of material that you get has a different little tier symbol next to it, and you could have bronze, silver, and gold. Tiering of materials is going to change slightly in BFA, in War Within. And this is very crucial, not because the tiers are technically changing dramatically to the point where they may have issues, but essentially the interaction of tiers of materials with how you craft gear is going to change. So it's for the good, at least so it seems. It's going to make things a little bit easier for players, and this is going to mean that the price disparity between materials is going to be a little bit less important, and so farming materials is going to be, of course, as important, but basically you're going to have a much stronger way to reduce the RNG effects that tiering of materials, and at least in terms of gathering, had on player performance and obviously crafting in general. So yeah, that's obviously super important. On top of that as well, there have been changes to crafting. So not only do we have no more inspiration, but we have concentration, which helps to alleviate the pain of that mechanic. But essentially the integration of all of these things is going to change slightly with NPC work orders now. So before, things like knowledge, things like getting work orders was quite difficult. Players relied on other players. A lot of the times guilds or strong player foundations would help a lot. But essentially what's happened now is that the ability to get work orders will appear through NPCs, and on top of that as well, we are eliminating inspiration, which removes a bit of RNG, and also knowledge is going to be promised to have a much better catch-up rate in the new expansion, which I think is a good thing overall, and players are going to be a lot less hindered by the knowledge gap. A lot of the times, if you didn't start crafting properly from the beginning of the expansion, essentially you just were not able to keep up. You just could not keep up with other crafters. So it's a good change overall, and it has a significant impact on the longevity of crafting as a gold making mechanism. So let's talk about making gold. Now we understand the concept of making gold, and we understand, of course, the changes that are coming to our main gold making mechanisms. We do need to discuss the actual goal and ability to make gold. Now, one thing is definitely for certain: gathering is still king in terms of getting gold, and not just any gathering, but mining and herbing will continue to be your predominant professions that you want to have if you're looking to make gold. Crafting can help you to continue to generate further gold, and we'll talk about that a little bit just now, but gathering still remains key to generating initial raw gold. Now, making or gathering materials generally speaking, has a huge ability in the beginning of any expansion because materials have a much higher level of value due to the fact that a lot of players are seeking them, and generally speaking, no one wants to farm them, at least on a casual level. So by collecting a ton of materials early on and creating and establishing good farming routes, you can end up pretty much, generally speaking, generating yourself a ton of raw gold early on in the expansion. And like I said, with the change to tiering of materials, you now have more reason than ever to continue to farm materials and to sell them throughout the course of an expansion, but especially stockpiling them early on and making sure that you trade them nice and early. But that's not all, because we can make gold very easily as well through the addition of some light crafting. Now, crafting can be an effective tool. Of course, we want to talk about things like crafting bags, crafting useful attire, but even crafting things like, for example, some light blue gears is going to be something that's going to be quite popular early on. Leveling speed, gearing speed, and essentially keeping up your leveling curve is crucial to a lot of players. And so creating blues and greens early on is still a profitable venture for quite a few players to partake in. Like I said, because of the changes to crafting in general as well, you now also have the ability to alleviate some of that RNG curve that you have. And of course, if you are gathering the materials, you may as well use some of them to craft. Now, I'm not saying crafting all your materials into gear is a good idea. It's not. But there are going to be a crucial couple, essential blues and greens that you're going to find along the way, whether they be certain trinkets, helmets, or just basically gear that a lot of players are going to be finding popular. For example, things like building up a whole bunch of great blues that players will buy up once they hit the immediate max level of the next expansion is always going to be great and hold a lot of value, whereas picking up or creating gear that players use and run out of very quickly may not hold that same value, because once people hit max level, first thing they want to do is they want to pick up something good for their character, generally to boost their item level. So that's a good way to continue making money, and is something I highly suggest you consider doing. So let's talk a little bit about, basically, when it comes to gold making, some of the do's and don'ts and some of the advantages you can gain from the early access. Now, firstly, let's talk about gathering. The reason we don't take skinning over herbing and mining is because the refresh rate on mobs at the beginning of an expansion is accelerated. Blizzard accelerate the mob respawn rate in pre-patch, but also in the expansion due to increased player population to basically provide for the lack of availability of mobs for quests. So by taking skinning at the beginning, where skinning is generated from mobs, and having a large amount of mobs, you have a large amount of supply, and thus skinning loses a lot of its intrinsic value, unfortunately. On top of that as well, one of the things we want to avoid in the very beginning is essentially what I like to call stockpiling of materials. So a lot of your materials hold their highest value right in the beginning of the game, but there are certain materials that you may want to consider just holding on for the first raid window. So don't stockpile all your materials, but there are definitely the rarer mats, especially those for tonics and trinks, that you may want to hold on to so that they can come in at the raid window and will have a slightly increased value due to their much higher demand. And then finally, let's talk about the pre-patch. So of course, there is a big advantage to be gained from joining the, I don't want to say pre-patch, the early access for the War Within expansion. By joining early access, you get 3 days early access to the game. This doesn't just mean early access to the quests, but early access to the materials. So when a portion of the player base, let's even just call it, could even be as high as 70%, join in an early access by farming yourself up materials in that state, You have less players to compete with, 30% of the game, although I think you'll probably find it's a lot more of the players have not bought early access, but you'll find that there's a reduced population of players to compete for resources, especially mining and herbing nodes, but also on top of that as well, when the increased player base spawns in, the demand for materials is going to go up. A lot of those players are going to have crafting professions. A lot of them are not going to want to go through the schlep of grinding and gathering materials, especially those who have a bit of gold. So you might find that a lot of them are going to be looking to craft some of that early 61, 62 gear, and so there your materials are going to have a lot of value. At the same time as well, crafting yourself some early 61 and 62 gear, even though it's not advised on a long period of time, could, or I say 61, 62, but that early entry level blue gear could actually hold a lot of value, especially if you are accessing early access, and you can then sell it to players as they enter to give them a short, quick power boost. So keep all of that in mind to take advantage of the early access. But that is that. That is everything we can talk about making gold. I am not by any means a goblin. I make enough gold to do whatever I want, but I don't make enough gold to be able to buy, anything in the game, or I'm not a wow bajillionaire. But of course, making gold is important, especially if you're into the raiding scene like myself, Mythic Plus, any kind of hard endgame content scene. And on top of that as well, you also want to make sure that you can make gold to purchase the items that you need. So, good day and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. In this video, we're going to talk about making gold. And